Picture a tent on the frozen banks of the Danube River. The year is 180 AD. Outside, the wind cuts through the darkness like a blade, and somewhere beyond the perimeter of the Roman camp, Germanic tribesmen are moving through the trees. The legions have held the line for years. They have bled for this border. They have buried their brothers in foreign soil to keep the empire safe. Inside that tent, by the light of a single oil lamp, the most powerful man on earth is dying. His name is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of the greatest military force the ancient world has ever seen, philosopher stoic, a man who spent his entire adult life trying to be worthy of the office he never asked for and never fully wanted. He is 68 years old. His lungs are failing. The campaign that has defined the last 14 years of his reign is not finished, and he knows it will not be finished by him. On the small table beside his cot sits a leather journal. The pages are filled with his handwriting, cramped and careful, not for posterity, but for himself. Notes to keep himself honest. Reminders to stay humble. Meditations on duty, on loss, on the acceptance of things beyond his control. He has been writing in that journal since he was a young man, and the entries from these final years have a different quality to them. They are the writings of a man who has begun to reckon with the one failure he cannot write his way out of. His son is 18 years old. Marcus has known for a long time what his son is. He has known it the way a man knows a wound has gone bad, not from a single moment of revelation, but from years of small signs accumulating until the truth becomes impossible to avoid. He has watched Commodus absorb everything the palace offered and reject everything the philosophers tried to teach. He has watched the boy grow tall and strong and beautiful and empty. Empty in the place where conscience lives. Empty in the place where other people's suffering registers as something real. Tonight, lying in his campaign tent while the Danube freezes outside, Marcus Aurelius reaches for his journal one last time. He does not write about the Germanic tribes. He does not write about border policy or military strategy or the financial pressures straining the treasury. He writes something shorter than usual, something that reads less like a philosophical meditation and more like a confession. Then he sets the pen down and stares at the ceiling of the tent and says nothing for a very long time. In the morning, he will send for Commodus. He will look at the boy who is about to inherit everything. He will want to say something that matters, something that will stick, something that will reach past the arrogance and the restlessness and find whatever small piece of his own soul might be hiding inside his son. And when the moment comes when Commodus walks through that tent flap and looks at him with those eyes that have never once shown genuine concern for another living person, Marcus Aurelius will open his mouth and find that the words are gone. Not because he cannot think of them, because he knows with the certainty of a dying man who has spent his life studying human nature that they will not land, that they never have. That all the philosophers and tutors and frontier campaigns and shared councils were not enough, and one last speech from a fading father will not be either. He will close his mouth. He will let his son stand there in silence for a moment, and then Commodus will leave the tent, and that will be the last conversation they ever have, and it will be the most important failure of Marcus Aurelius's life. To understand how Rome got to that frozen tent, you have to go back 19 years to the spring of 161 AD, when a woman named Faustina gave birth to twin boys inside the imperial palace. Marcus Aurelius wept when he heard. Not from joy alone. He had already buried children. He knew how quickly the gods could take back what they gave. He held both boys carefully, already calculating the odds, already bracing for loss. One of the twins died within months. The other lived. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus, and from the moment he drew his first breath in that palace, an entire world organized itself around his comfort. Try to understand what that means in practical terms. The imperial palace in Rome is not a home. It is a machine for producing power, and every gear in that machine understands that its survival depends on the happiness of whoever sits at the top. Commodus was not born into a family. He was born into a system of total deference. Nurses who anticipated his cries before they began. Slaves whose entire purpose was to ensure he was never bored. Guards who materialized at his side like shadows and disappeared when he waved them away. Tutors who were brilliant men, but who also understood with crystal clarity that their careers depended on not pushing too hard against whatever the prince resisted. Marcus tried to counteract this. He genuinely tried. He brought in the finest minds in the empire to educate his son. He insisted on military instruction. He sat with Commodus himself in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud from the Stoics, trying to model what a disciplined mind looked like in practice. He was not an absent father by the standards of Roman emperors. He was actually more present than most, squeezing time with his children into the margins of a reign that demanded everything he had. But Marcus had a blind spot. It was not stupidity and it was not negligence. It was something more painful than either of those things. It was the inability of a good man to fully accept that he had produced a son who lacked the basic moral architecture that Marcus himself had spent his entire life building. To accept that truth completely would have required Marcus to ask a question he was not prepared to answer if Commodus became a monster. What did that say about the man who raised him? So Marcus explained away the signs. The cruelty was immaturity, the lack of empathy was a phase. The coldness in those eyes was just boyish detachment, something the responsibilities of adulthood would correct. He believed this the way a man believes what he needs to believe to keep functioning. And in the meantime, Commodus grew. The first sign that could not be explained away came when Commodus was 11 years old. It was an ordinary afternoon in the palace, the kind of afternoon that happens thousands of times in a boy's childhood without leaving any trace. Commodus had spent the day in lessons, rhetoric, military formations, another lecture on virtue and the obligations of leadership. He had sat through all of it with the practiced patience of a child who has learned that certain performances are required of him, and when the last tutor finally left, he went to take his bath. For a Roman aristocrat, the bath is not a chore. It is a ritual. Steam and scented oils and the careful choreography of attendants who know exactly how hot the water should be and exactly how long to hold each stage of the process. Commodus had been taking baths in this palace his entire life, and the water had always been perfect because the consequences of imperfection were severe enough that nobody risked them. That afternoon, something went wrong. The furnace attendant had been working since before dawn. Maybe the logs were wet. Maybe he miscounted the minutes. Whatever the reason, the water was not hot enough, and when Commodus stepped into the bath and felt the temperature, something ignited inside him that was not simply a child's frustration. He came out of the water screaming. His voice bounced off the marble walls. He demanded to know who was responsible. The furnace attendant, a man covered in soot from a day of physical labor, was brought before the prince. And Commodus, 11 years old, looked at this exhausted man and declared that he should be thrown into the furnace and burned alive. Not beaten, not dismissed, burned. The adults in the room went cold. This was not a tantrum. Tantrums are hot and brief and followed by shame. What Commodus had just issued was an order delivered with the calm certainty of someone who expected to be obeyed. The imperial bloodline gave real weight to words like that even from a boy. Nobody in that room wanted to discover what happened if they simply refused. So they improvised. They praised the prince's sense of justice. They marched the terrified furnace worker out of sight. Then they grabbed bundles of raw wool soaked in animal fat and hurled them into the flames. The grease caught immediately. Thick black smoke. A horrible smell. One of the attendants screamed with convincing agony. They brought Commodus to the furnace chamber just long enough to see the smoke and hear the sound, and they watched his face while he stood there, breathing in the stench of burning fat. He did not tremble. He did not turn away. He did not ask a single question about whether a lukewarm bath was actually worth a man's life. He simply absorbed the scene with the expression of someone watching a minor administrative problem being resolved, and then he walked back to his rooms and asked what was for dinner. The attendants told each other this would stay buried. They were wrong. In a palace that size, with that many people moving through the corridors, nothing stays buried forever. Someone talked. Maybe it was a slave who drank too much and let the story slip to someone who worked in a different wing. Maybe a guard mentioned it to a friend outside the palace walls. However it traveled, the story moved, and eventually it reached someone who asked the wrong question in front of the wrong person, and the wrong person mentioned it to Commodus. He discovered that he had been deceived, that no one had burned, that the screaming was theater and the smoke was wool, and the man he believed he had executed was still alive, somewhere in the palace going about his days as if nothing had happened. Commodus did not feel embarrassed. He did not find it funny. He did not feel even a shadow of relief that a life had been spared. He ordered the furnace worker killed for real. And then he turned his anger on the men who had dared to spare the man without his permission, because sparing a man who had been condemned was another form of defiance. And defiance was the one thing he was never going to tolerate. The story reached Marcus Aurelius on the Danube frontier. He was in the middle of a military campaign that was grinding through its fifth or sixth brutal winter, and he sat with this information for a long time before he wrote about it. What he wrote that night in his journal was not anger. It was something quieter and more devastating. He wrote about emptiness, about a void where compassion was supposed to live. He wrote, "I have seen angry men and frightened men and ambitious men, but I have never seen a child watch a supposed execution and feel nothing at all, not horror and not relief and not a flicker of doubt about whether the punishment matched the offense. I do not know what to do with this." What made the story worse was not the cruelty itself. Roman history was full of powerful men who were cruel. Cruelty and proximity to power was a recognizable phenomenon, something you could study and categorize, and to some degree predict. What made the furnace story different was the absence, the nothing. A child who orders a man burned alive over temperature, and when the order is carried out, does not feel proud or vindicated or even sated. He feels the mild satisfaction of a corrected administrative error and goes back to his evening. And when he discovers the correction was faked, his response is not relief that a man lived. It is outrage that his order was not followed. The man's life is simply not a variable in the calculation. It never was. This was what Marcus was trying to write around in his journal that night on the Danube. Not the cruelty, the indifference, the structural inability to register another person's existence as something that carried moral weight. He had read enough philosophy to understand that this was not immaturity. He had enough experience with human nature to understand that it was not a phase. But he was also a father who loved his son, and loving someone, and seeing them clearly are two activities that frequently resist each other. And Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, king master of Stoic self-examination, chose love over clarity for longer than the empire could afford. He responded the only way he knew how. He pulled Commodus out of the marble palace and brought him to the frontier. The reasoning was sound. If luxury and isolation had failed to build a conscience, then perhaps reality would. Real soldiers, real wounds, real consequences. Let the boy see mud and disease and men dying far from home and understand in his body not just his intellect, that ruling meant carrying the weight of other people's lives. Commodus absorbed a completely different lesson. He discovered that armed men dropped to their knees when he approached. He discovered that the voice which had once commanded a single slave could move entire legions. He discovered that the raw physical sensation of thousands of soldiers snapping to attention at his presence was the most intoxicating feeling he had ever experienced. The lectures about sacrifice rolled right off him. The sight of bandaged veterans meant nothing. But standing in front of a formed cohort, while their hobnailed sandals crashed against the ground in unison as they came to attention, that reached something inside him that philosophy never had. Marcus watched this happen and kept writing. He told himself to be patient. He told himself that the responsibilities of actual rulership would force maturity in ways that observation could not. He elevated Commodus to co-emperor, while the boy was barely old enough to shave, hoping that shared power would generate shared seriousness. He brought him into Senate sessions. He seated him at diplomatic receptions. He gave him every opportunity to grow into the role that history had assigned him. The gap between what Marcus hoped for and what Commodus was kept widening. What Marcus could not fully accept even at the end was that Commodus was not unfinished. He was not a rough stone that needed more polishing. He was not going through a phase that would resolve itself when the weight of the throne settled on his shoulders. He was exactly who he appeared to be, and he had been that person since he was old enough to give orders, and no amount of philosophy or frontier hardship or shared governance was going to change the fundamental architecture of a mind that simply did not register other people as fully real. That winter on the Danube, with his lungs failing and his campaign unfinished, Marcus Aurelius finally allowed himself to know this completely. Not just to suspect it, to know it. The journal entries from those final weeks have a quality of resignation that his earlier writing never shows. He was a man who had spent his life insisting that a disciplined mind could confront any truth without flinching. And in the end, the truth he had flinched from longest was the one sleeping 2 tents away. When Commodus came to see him on the morning of his death, Marcus looked at his son for a long time. Commodus stood at the edge of the cot with his arms at his sides, healthy and strong, and already somewhere else in his mind, already thinking about Rome and what came next and how quickly he could get back to heated marble floors and proper baths. Marcus opened his mouth. He had things he wanted to say, important things, things he had been turning over for years. But looking at those eyes, he understood with complete finality that the words would not reach. They had never reached. The distance between them was not geographical. It was constitutive. It was built into the very nature of who his son was. He closed his mouth. He let the silence hold for a moment. Then he looked away toward the tent wall, toward nothing in particular, and Commodus read this as dismissal and left. The flap of the tent fell back into place. The lamp flickered. Marcus Aurelius exhaled slowly and did not exhale again with any purpose after that. There is a particular cruelty in the way history arranges these final moments. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire adult life in the practice of articulating truth. He wrote more clearly about the human condition than almost any figure of antiquity. He could describe grief, ambition, self-deception, and the mechanics of moral failure with a precision that still astonishes readers 2,000 years later. And in the single most important conversation of his life, when the truth he had been unable to speak for 18 years finally needed to be spoken, he discovered that the words were gone. Not because he lacked them, because he understood with the finality that dying men sometimes reach, that the person who needed to receive them was constitutionally incapable of being changed by them. You can give a speech to a stone wall. The stone wall does not become a window. This is the kind of knowledge that takes a lifetime to earn and a lifetime to avoid. Marcus Aurelius earned it and avoided it in equal measure, and the empire paid the cost. In the spring of 180 CAD, Commodus became the sole ruler of an empire stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the Egyptian desert. He was 18 years old. He had never been told no in any way that left a lasting impression. He had never experienced a consequence that truly cost him something. He had never looked at another human being and felt in his body that their suffering mattered as much as his comfort. And now every human being in the known world was subject to his mood. The Senate hoped that advisors would keep him in check. The people hoped the philosopher's son would govern with the philosopher's wisdom. The generals hoped he would honor the campaigns his father had bled to sustain. None of them fully understood what kind of man had just closed his fingers around the most powerful office on earth. They were about to learn. The first thing Commodus did when he became emperor was end the war. Not because the war was unwinnable, not because the terms were favorable, not because his generals advised it or the Senate recommended it or any strategic calculation pointed toward peace. He ended it because the frontier was cold and dirty and uncomfortable, and Rome had heated baths and perfumed oil and whatever he wanted the moment he asked for it. He signed a treaty that his father would have torn apart and called it wisdom, and he turned his back on the Danube and never looked at it again. The generals who had served Marcus Aurelius for decades watched this happen in silence. These were men who had spent their careers fighting for that border, men who had buried friends in that frozen ground. They looked at each other across the campaign tables and understood what the signing of that treaty actually meant, which was not that the empire had found peace, but that the empire now had an emperor who would sacrifice strategic reality for personal comfort. They said nothing because saying something was not an option. They filed away what they had learned and went back to their duties with the careful expressions of men who have learned to keep their faces very still. In Rome, Commodus walked back into the machinery of imperial governance and immediately pushed most of it aside. Petitions, judicial hearings, provincial reports, treasury summaries, letters from governors begging for guidance on matters that would determine the welfare of millions of people. He glanced at the mountain of obligation and delegated almost everything to his inner circle, not because he was building a capable administrative team, but because the work was tedious and he had better things to do. If this had been the whole story, history might have filed him away as a disappointing but manageable emperor. Rome had survived indolent rulers before. The bureaucracy was deep enough and experienced enough to keep the machinery running even when the man at the top was disengaged. But what happened next was not mere indolence. It was something that grew in the fertile soil of absolute power and unlimited flattery, and it grew into something that Rome had genuinely never seen before. The courtiers who surrounded Commodus needed his favor to keep their wealth and their positions and their heads. This is true of all imperial courts, but in the court of Commodus, it produced a particular toxin because the man they were flattering was not insecure in the normal way, was not fishing for reassurance, was not performing confidence, while secretly doubting himself. Commodus was genuinely convinced of his own superiority over all other human beings, and when the courtiers around him began feeding that conviction, rather than simply managing it, the conviction grew into something that stopped resembling normal arrogance and started resembling something else entirely. They did not just tell him he was powerful. They told him he was chosen, anointed, favored by the gods in a way that no Roman ruler had ever been favored. They told him that his physical strength surpassed that of any mortal man, that his instincts were divinely guided, that the gods themselves had sent him to Rome as a gift to civilization. They said these things because they needed to say them, and they said them with enough conviction and repetition that the man who heard them began to build his understanding of reality around them. This is how Commodus arrived at Hercules. Hercules was the great strongman of Roman mythology, the hero who strangled monsters and cleaned out corruption and triumphed over impossible odds through nothing but muscle and courage and the favor of the divine. Commodus looked at that figure and did not see a model to emulate. He saw a mirror. He began appearing before the public, draped in a lion's skin, with a wooden club in his hand, his chest bare, performing the image of the legendary hero for audiences who understood that the correct response was ecstatic adoration. Imperial coins were reminted with his face framed in divine iconography. Sculptors carved statues blending his features with Hercules' physique. Official documents began referring to him not merely as emperor, but as Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules, as if the distinction between a man and a myth had simply been dissolved by imperial decree. To question any of this was to question a god, and questioning a god meant death. Everyone understood the terms. But symbols were not enough. Commodus needed to feel the godhood in his body. He needed a stage large enough for the performance he had in mind. And in Rome in the 2nd century, there was only one stage that could hold what he required. The Colosseum had served every emperor before Commodus as a tool of public control. Free entertainment, exotic spectacles, the channeling of the crowd's energy into sanctioned outlets. Every emperor before him had managed the arena from a distance, sitting in the imperial box above the action, patron, and patron-only never participant. The distance was part of the dignity. The emperor did not descend to the sand. The sand was for slaves and criminals and desperate men who had sold their freedom for a meal. Commodus descended to the sand. The first announcement spread through the city like a fever. The emperor would not merely attend the games, he would compete in them. He would fight as a gladiator in the arena in front of the entire population of Rome. The Senate received this news with the particular stillness of men who have learned to arrange their faces before anyone else can read them. The people processed it with something between disbelief and a deep, formless dread. When the day arrived, there he stood, Commodus costumed as Hercules' feet planted on blood-stained sand, while the Colosseum held its collective breath. What followed was not combat, it was theater with sharp edges. Every opponent who entered the arena against Commodus had been selected and prepared in advance. Some were chained, others carried wooden practice weapons against his real armor. A few had been given substances that left them unsteady on their feet before they ever stepped into the sunlight. When he hunted animals, it was from elevated platforms and behind heavy barriers, firing arrows at creatures that could not reach him. There was never any actual danger. There was only the performance of danger repeated again and again for an audience that was required to believe it. The senators sat in the front row so close that the heat from the sand reached their faces so close they could sometimes feel the droplets from a kill landing on their ceremonial robes. These were men who had led legions, men who had governed provinces the size of modern nations, men who had negotiated with foreign kings and administered the complex machinery of an empire that functioned only because serious people were willing to do serious work. Now they sat in their formal chairs beneath their laurel wreaths and watched their emperor play a rigged game with real weapons, while crowds of soldiers seated throughout the audience monitored their expressions for any sign of insufficient enthusiasm. They learned quickly. A visible wince was dangerous. A moment of inattention could be reported. Even turning your head at the wrong instant might be noticed by the wrong person and described later to the wrong ears. So they developed techniques. The most famous of these was the laurel leaves. Men who had commanded armies in the field began chewing on the leaves of their ceremonial wreaths during the performances, keeping their jaws in constant motion so that any involuntary expression of disgust or horror could be attributed to the mechanical act of chewing rather than to whatever was happening in front of them. It was a small absurdity in the context of the larger horror, but it tells you everything you need to know about what it cost to survive in proximity to this man. The most accomplished soldiers and statesmen in the world reduced to chewing leaves to hide their faces. One afternoon, Commodus had an ostrich brought into the arena. He executed the animal with a single theatrical stroke, severing its head. Then, with the head still twitching in his hand, he walked directly to the front row of senators and moved slowly along the line, holding the severed neck in the direction of each man as he passed. He said nothing. He did not need to. The message was delivered in the language that everyone in that building understood perfectly. Your head separates from your body exactly as easily. I will do this whenever I choose, and you will sit here and watch and applaud. Somewhere in the stands, one senator cracked. The pressure of years of this, the absurdity of the ostrich, the proximity of the twitching head, something broke through the careful control he had spent months cultivating, and a sound came out of him. Not a scream, nervous laughter, the kind that escapes a human being when horror becomes too large for any other response. He caught it almost immediately, covered his mouth, looked around to see who had noticed. Enough people had noticed. He did not survive the year. And there is a woman who witnessed all of this. Her name is Marcia. She came into the imperial household not as a person with choices, but as a girl without them, the daughter of a freedman with no money and no political connections acquired for the palace through the mechanisms that move people like pieces across a board in ancient Rome. She learned early that survival and proximity to this man required a specific set of skills. You had to read the room faster than anyone else. You had to know his moods before he knew them himself. You had to smile at the exact right intensity and be interested in exactly what he was interested in, and invisible at exactly the moments when invisibility was required. Marcia became over years extraordinarily good at all of these things. She watched the ostrich. She watched the senator laugh, and then watched his face as he understood what he had just done. She sat in the imperial section with her expression perfectly composed and her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about the furnace story she had heard years ago about an 11-year-old boy and a man who was supposed to be burned alive and wasn't, and about what happened when Commodus discovered the deception. She understood something in that moment that would take years to fully resolve into action. This man did not become what he was by accident. He was built by a system that never once told him the truth. And now the entire Roman world was paying the price of that system's failure. Inside the palace, the horror was of a different and more intimate variety. Commodus had assembled around him what ancient writers describe as a vast household of companions, men and women accumulated from across the empire through purchase and acquisition, and the kind of coercion that doesn't look like coercion because no one is holding a visible weapon. They were not partners or confidants or even favorites in the way that powerful men have always kept favorites. They were in the most literal sense available property. They were assigned names from mythology or dressed in costumes that amused him or organized according to categories that existed only in his own mind. Their autonomy ended at the palace gate. Their previous lives ceased to exist the moment the door closed behind them. The evening gatherings in the imperial residence were events that left marks on everyone who survived them, and not everyone survived them. Commodus drank without restraint, and alcohol did not soften him. It sharpened something. He would call on members of his household to perform degrading acts in front of assembled guests, and he would watch the faces of those guests while this happened, cataloging any flicker of discomfort, filing it away for later. If someone looked away, that person became a person of interest. If someone's expression suggested that they found the proceedings anything less than delightful, that person had a shortened life expectancy. He took particular pleasure in humiliating men of rank. The Praetorian prefect, the officer directly responsible for the emperor's personal security and one of the most powerful military figures in the capital, was ordered on one occasion to strip naked and dance in front of a room full of guests while holding small cymbals. The man could not refuse. Refusal was death. So he danced scarlet with humiliation while every person in the room burned with the effort of maintaining expressions of appropriate appreciation. The lesson for everyone present was absolute and required no elaboration. No title, no achievement, no service record protected you from this. The most powerful officer in the Roman military had just been turned into entertainment. What exactly did you think your own position was worth? Dinners could end in blood, a servant who moved too slowly, a messenger who brought unwelcome news. Anyone who caught the wrong kind of attention at the wrong moment could go from guest to victim between one course and the next, and everyone at the table would sit with their eyes on their plates and their hands in their laps and eat their food. Because to react was to be noticed, and being noticed might be the last thing you ever did. There was also what the ancient sources describe with the careful language of men writing in the shadow of consequences as his private medical interests. He would summon servants under the pretense of attending to some minor complaint, and he would pick up surgical instruments, and there was never any intention to heal. He made incisions to observe what lay beneath the skin. He studied the body as a mechanism for experiencing damage with the detached curiosity of a man who genuinely finds the subject interesting and has never encountered a reason to restrain his interest. The screams that came through the palace walls at night became a feature of the soundscape, the way thunder becomes a feature of a storm. People learned to hear them without reacting. You had to learn that, or you could not function. In the year 182 AD, something happened that cracked something open in Commodus and let a new kind of paranoia flood in. Before that, in the years immediately following his accession, there had been a brief period when the damage was still mostly contained within the palace and the arena. The population experienced it as a kind of uneasy theater, unsettling, but at a distance. What happened in the Colosseum was public and visible and could at least be processed as spectacle, however grotesque. What happened in the palace corridors and the private dining rooms was rumor and whisper and the terrified silence of people who had witnessed things they were never going to describe to anyone outside those walls. But the corruption was systemic now, not merely personal. Commodus had installed favorites throughout the machinery of government, not because they were competent or loyal in any meaningful sense, but because they were willing to perform the specific kind of debasement that confirmed his sense of absolute supremacy. A man named Cleander had accumulated enormous informal power in the imperial household, operating as a kind of broker between the emperor's caprices and the administrative needs of the empire. Cleander understood with the clarity of someone who has studied power from the inside that the machinery of governance was simply another resource to be extracted. He began selling government positions, governorships, military commands, seats in the Senate itself. He turned the entire apparatus of Roman public service into a for-profit enterprise. And because the proceeds flowed in directions that kept Commodus comfortable and entertained, the arrangement was permitted to continue. The damage this caused to the actual functioning of government was not immediately visible, because governments, like large ships, take a long time to sink after the hull has been breached. The provinces continued to be administered. The armies continued to function. The supply chains continued to move grain and timber and goods around the Mediterranean. But the men running these systems were increasingly men who had paid for their positions rather than earned them, men whose primary qualification was their ability to raise enough money to purchase access, and the decisions they made reflected this. The rot was spreading from the center outward slowly enough that each individual symptom could be explained away, but comprehensively enough that the cumulative effect was accelerating toward catastrophe. When food shortages and administrative abuses finally sparked riots in the streets, Commodus's response was both revealing and efficient. He handed Cleander over to the crowd. The man who had been operating as his surrogate for years, extracting wealth from the empire's institutions, with the emperor's implicit blessing, was delivered to the mob and torn apart, and Commodus watched the proceedings with the calm of someone who has learned that the simplest way to avoid accountability is to ensure that the nearest available person absorbs it instead. He expressed no grief. He offered no explanation. He had found Cleander useful and then found him inconvenient, and that transition from useful to inconvenient is the only biography that mattered in proximity to him. His sister Lucilla had once been more important than he was. She was older, had been married to an emperor, carried herself with the authority of someone who understood power from the inside. She had watched her younger brother ascend the throne and watched the empire change around him, and she had arrived through years of observation at a conclusion that others were reaching in whispered fragments, but nobody dared say aloud. If this continued, there would be nothing left. Not of the institutions her father had spent his life trying to strengthen, not of the legal frameworks that gave the empire its coherence, not of the basic understanding that power existed to serve something larger than the man who held it. Lucilla organized a conspiracy. A group of senators and military men agreed to strike at Commodus as he entered a public theater. It was a crude plan born of desperation rather than careful calculation. A young man would step forward with a blade, deliver a prepared line about senatorial justice, and kill the emperor before the bodyguards could close the distance. Lucilla and her associates would then secure the Praetorian Guard and stabilize the empire under new leadership. The assassin hesitated. One heartbeat of frozen indecision at the crucial moment, and the guards were on him before he recovered. Under interrogation, he gave up every name he knew, and the names led to Lucilla. The emperor's own sister had reached for a knife against a man who believed he was a gate walking the earth. Commodus did not execute her immediately. He exiled her first to an island stripped of everything that had made her formidable. Exile under a ruler this paranoid was simply death with a waiting period. The order came eventually, and Lucilla was killed far from Rome. Her name erased from official record, her influence reduced to nothing. But here is the thing about what Lucilla's conspiracy actually cost Commodus beyond the obvious political threat. Lucilla was the last person alive who remembered him as a child, the last person who carried memories of him before the palace machinery fully formed him into what he became. When she died, that memory died with her. There was no longer anyone within reach who remembered a version of him that might have been different. His wife, Brutia Crispina, did not outlast the decade. The charge was adultery, the standard accusation Roman emperors reach for when they want a woman removed without the trouble of explanation. She was exiled to Capri and subsequently killed. No trial, no defense, no reason that anyone outside the palace would ever be allowed to know. After Lucilla and Crispina, the pattern accelerated. The Quintilli brothers, two of the most admired men in Rome, wealthy and accomplished, and genuinely respected, were accused of conspiracy. The accusations were not precise enough to matter. They were destroyed and their estates seized, and their fate became another object lesson in the mathematics of survival under Commodus. If two of the most respected citizens in the empire could be annihilated on a whim, then the concept of protected status was simply fictional. There was no floor. There was no level of achievement or loyalty or invisibility that put you beyond reach. Paranoia does not arrive all at once. It grows in layers. Each new threat, real or imagined, adds another layer. Each new execution creates new grievances, which generate new perceived threats, which justify new executions. By the late 180s, Commodus was cycling through high officials at a pace that left the machinery of government visibly strained. City prefects, praetorian commanders, palace administrators, they rose and crashed with the regularity of waves, each one elevated in a burst of imperial favor, and destroyed the moment something shifted. The Senate had stopped pretending to govern. It existed to applaud or be punished, and everyone in it had made their private peace with which of those two options they were going to choose. Marcia watched all of this from her position, which was closer to the center than almost anyone else's. She had been with him long enough to understand his patterns better than he understood them himself. She knew when the mood shifted, knew which conversations to avoid, knew which expressions to wear to each occasion. She had made herself indispensable, not through affection alone, but through usefulness, through the accumulated competence of someone who has spent years learning a single unpredictable subject. She knew things that no one else knew, and she understood with the precision of long observation that this knowledge was both her greatest protection and her greatest danger. In late 192 AD, Commodus announced his plans for the new year. On the 1st of January 193 AD, he would inaugurate his consulate not in the traditional formal robes of the office, but dressed as a gladiator. He would emerge not from the imperial palace, but from the gladiatorial barracks. He would govern Rome openly from the identity of an arena fighter, and the most honored civilian office in the history of the Republic would be absorbed into his fantasy of divine combat. Whispers attached themselves to the announcement. Whispers about executions, about senators who would not see the morning of the 2nd of January, about lists. Latus heard these whispers. Latus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, which meant that he was on paper the second most powerful man in Rome. He had served Commodus for years, and he was not a naive man, and he had been performing the same calculations that every person in the emperor's orbit performed as a matter of daily survival. He had power. He had the loyalty of the men who protected the emperor. He had, in theory, the means to act. And he had been choosing day after day, month after month, to wait for a better moment. Every time he waited, someone died. Every time he waited, the situation became more extreme. Every time he waited, he told himself that the circumstances weren't quite right, that the timing wasn't quite aligned, that there was a better option somewhere ahead if he was patient enough to find it. He had been telling himself this for years, and the years had not produced a better option. They had produced more bodies and a man who was now planning to declare himself a gladiator consul and possibly eliminate everyone in the Senate who might object. Latus stood in the late autumn of 192 AD and understood something that the most honest part of him had known for a long time. There was no better moment coming. This was the moment. The question was whether he was the man who would recognize it. He thought about the generals who had watched Commodus sign away the Danube treaties 12 years earlier, men who had served Marcus Aurelius, men who had bled for that border and then stood in silence while their work was erased. They had made the calculation that silence was survivable and service was obligatory, and the emperor's wishes were the emperor's wishes no matter how obviously wrong. Some of them were still alive. Most of them were not. The ones who were still alive had survived by becoming incrementally smaller and quieter and more accommodating with each passing year, until the version of themselves that remained bore very little resemblance to the men who had once commanded legions in the field. Latus did not want to be that calculation anymore. He was not certain he had a choice about it. The last night of 192 AD was cold and clear over Rome. The city was alive with the sounds of a population preparing to mark the change of the year. Wine in the streets, fires on the hillsides, the ordinary noise of a civilization that did not know what was happening inside the imperial palace while it celebrated. Inside the palace, Marcia found the tablet. She was not searching for it. She came across it the way you come across things you were not meant to find in the course of doing something ordinary, moving through the administrative correspondence that passed through the household in the normal way. It was small. The handwriting was neat and careful, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who takes methodical pleasure in the act of setting things down in order. It was a list of names. Each name had a notation beside it. The notations described methods and timing. She read through the list with the surface of her mind while the deeper part of her went very still. Her name was there. Eclectus was there. Laetus was there. 3 names. 3 people who had been in proximity to Commodus long enough to know things that powerful men do not like others to know. 3 people who had, in the arithmetic of imperial paranoia, accumulated enough knowledge and enough independence to become in the mind of a man who had been afraid of genuine loyalty for his entire adult life, a liability rather than an asset. They were scheduled to be killed at dawn. She put the tablet down. She put it down carefully exactly where she found it, and she walked at a normal pace through the corridors of the palace that she had navigated for years, and she found Eclectus. And she told him what she had seen, and the 2 of them found Laetus, and the 3 of them stood together in a room and looked at each other. There was no discussion about whether the information was accurate. There was no negotiation about options. There was no debate about whether to wait and see, no suggestion that perhaps a conversation with Commodus might resolve the misunderstanding, no voice arguing for patience or another approach. They had all lived long enough inside the machinery of this man's court to understand that the list was exactly what it appeared to be, and that the time between now and dawn was exactly as short as it appeared to be. Whatever they were going to do, they had hours in which to do it. Latus was the one who said it first, not in dramatic terms, not with the language of righteousness or revolution or historical necessity. He said it the way a soldier states a tactical reality. They had 2 choices. They could wait for morning, in which case they would be dead by the time the city finished celebrating. Or they could act tonight, in which case the empire would have no emperor by morning, and whatever came next would come next. Eclectus controlled the keys and the household staff and the logistics of the inner palace. He could redirect personnel, create absences, ensure that the right people were elsewhere at the right time without anyone understanding why until it was too late to matter. Latus controlled the guard. He could isolate the emperor's private quarters. He could ensure that the soldiers who would ordinarily respond to a disturbance were occupied elsewhere or were men whose loyalty he had spent years quietly cultivating. And Marcia. Marcia had access that neither of them had. She was the one person in the palace who could approach Commodus while he was relaxed, while his guard was genuinely down, while his arrogance operated as a blindfold. He trusted her the way a man trusts a fixture of his environment, not with the careful trust you extend to an equal, which always includes some awareness that the other person has their own interior life and their own interests. He trusted her the way you trust a chair to hold your weight, the trust that comes from never having asked whether the chair might have reasons of its own. She knew this about him. She had always known it. For years, this knowledge had been one of the tools she used to navigate her own survival. Tonight, it was something else. Marcia prepared the wine herself. She did not rush. She did not tremble. She had already made the decision, and the clarity that follows a decision made completely is different from any other state of mind. She thought about the furnace worker. She thought about the senator who had laughed and not lived to see another winter. She thought about Lucilla, who had moved first and moved badly and paid for it with everything she had. She thought about the screams she had heard through the palace walls on nights when no official account would ever record what happened in those rooms. She measured the poison with the steady hands of someone performing a task that has been decided and needs only to be done. Commodus was in his private bath when she brought the cup. The steam was thick. He was relaxed, the specific relaxation of someone who has spent a day in absolute power and expects another. He was probably thinking about the morning, about the ceremony, about the gladiator armor he would wear, and the entrance he would make in the faces of the senators when they understood that the world they had known had been officially replaced by something else. He was thinking about these things, and Marcia walked in with the wine, and he took the cup from her hands and drank because he had been taking cups from her hands for years, and the idea that this cup was different had not and would not occur to him. His arrogance was the last useful thing he ever possessed. The poison took hold slowly at first, then with sudden violence. His body, trained for years in the arena and conditioned to physical punishment, fought it with the stubbornness of muscle memory. He began to vomit. His system was clawing for survival with everything it had. Marcia withdrew from the room and moved through the corridor to where Eclectus was waiting, and she told him what she saw, and they both understood immediately that the situation had entered the territory of the uncontrolled. If Commodus survived the poison, if he recovered enough to understand what had been done, the response would not stop at 3 people. It would tear the city apart. Every person who had ever exchanged a meaningful glance with any of them, every servant who had heard a word, every guard who had been redirected that evening, all of them would be dismantled piece by piece until nothing was left. This was not speculation. They had watched this man operate for years. They knew exactly what he was capable of when he believed himself threatened, and what was happening in that bath chamber right now was the most threatening thing that had ever been done to him. They sent for Narcissus. Narcissus was a professional wrestler. He had trained alongside Commodus in the private sessions that the emperor used to maintain his physical conditioning, which meant he knew the emperor's body the way an opponent knows a body, its habits, its reflexes, its strengths, and its specific vulnerabilities. He was not a politician or a planner or a man with any particular investment in the future of Roman governance. He was a man who was told what was happening and what was needed, and either the explanation or the implication of what morning would bring, if he refused, was sufficient. The palace had gone very quiet around the emperor's wing. Most of the household had been redirected through various pretexts. A few trusted servants had been positioned to intercept anyone approaching. The ordinary noise of the building continued at a distance, normal enough to avoid triggering any alarm, in the larger structure of guards and staff who knew nothing of what was happening. Narcissus entered the room. There was no Colosseum, no tens of thousands of screaming witnesses, no elevated platform, no barriers, no opponents selected and hobbled and drugged in advance, no armor, no weapons staged for theatrical effect. There was wet marble and steam and the sound of a man who had renamed months and cities and legions and believed himself beyond the reach of mortal consequence, fighting with the remainder of whatever the poison had left him. He would have fought. The body fights even when the mind is compromised, and Commodus had spent years conditioning his body to endure punishment. He clawed and thrashed and tried to use the stone walls for leverage. But the poison had stolen the coordination from his muscles, and the surprise had stolen whatever preparation his instincts might have provided, and the grip that locked around his throat had been built by years of professional training and was not going to falter. The god who had renamed the months could not summon enough air to call for help. The pressure held, the struggle weakened, and in a private room on the last night of 192 AD, without ceremony and without audience, and without any of the theatrical apparatus he had spent 12 years constructing around himself, the Emperor of Rome died the way every mortal does, quietly, alone, with no one present who would miss him. The three conspirators and the wrestler stood in the silence that followed and breathed. They did not speak immediately. There is a particular quality to the silence after something irreversible has happened, when the decision that could not be undone has been executed and the world has permanently changed, and you are standing inside the new version of the world that you have made, and the weight of it is settling onto your shoulders from a height you cannot quite measure yet. They stood in that silence for a moment that stretched. Then they moved. Because they had perhaps 4 hours before Rome woke up, and in those 4 hours they needed to put something in place that would hold the empire together long enough to prevent what was coming if they failed. The body was prepared. The story was natural illness, sudden and catastrophic, the kind of death that strikes powerful men without warning and requires no further investigation. Servants who could be trusted with silence were given instructions. Servants who could not be trusted were kept away from the relevant corridors through the remainder of the night. Latus went to work on the Praetorian Guard. This was the most dangerous piece of the operation because the guard was theoretically the emperor's protection, and their loyalty was theoretically to the man on the throne. In practice, the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard had always been a more complicated thing than the theory suggested, oriented toward the man who commanded them day to day as much as the man they technically served. And Latus had spent years building the relationships he needed for exactly this kind of moment. By the time the sky began to lighten, he had secured enough of the key officers. They needed a name, an emperor to present to the Senate and the Guard in the city when morning came, and the announcement had to be made. They chose Pertinax. He was a man in his 60s, a veteran senator, and former military commander with a reputation for integrity and competence that stretched back decades. He was the kind of man Marcus Aurelius might have chosen. Serious experience committed to the idea that governance was a responsibility rather than a performance. He was in almost every measurable way the right person for the moment. He was also walking into a situation that had been poisoned at the root. The Senate ratified his accession with something between relief and desperation. Statues of Commodus were hauled down before the day was over. The Senate proclaimed a formal condemnation of his memory, the damnatio memoriae, which in Roman law meant that his name was to be removed from public inscriptions, the months returned to their original names, the cities undedicated. Rome set about trying to erase 12 years of accumulated damage with the tools of official record, which is to say with words on stone, which is to say with inadequate instruments. You cannot undo a decade of institutional trauma with a Senate vote and a mason's chisel. The damage had not stayed on the surface where chisels could reach it. It had soaked into the foundations. The army had been shaped by years of watching the office of emperor produce spectacle rather than governance. The Senate had been conditioned to applaud rather than deliberate. The Praetorian Guard had watched one man rule through the complete absence of accountability and drawn their own conclusions about what power actually meant and who actually held it. Pertinax lasted 87 days. The Praetorian Guard killed him. He had tried to impose discipline. He had tried to restore financial order. He had tried to reduce the extravagance that had hollowed out the treasury over 12 years of Commodus's performances and personal accounts and the constant hemorrhaging of public money into private entertainment. He had behaved, in other words, like a man who believed that his role was to serve the empire rather than to be served by it. And this was precisely the kind of behavior that 12 years of Commodus had made incomprehensible to men who had learned that the emperor was an entertainment rather than a standard. The Guard had grown accustomed to a world where the emperor's primary function was to be spectacular and dangerous and unpredictable and rich. Pertinax was none of these things. He was serious, incompetent, and fiscally responsible, and committed to the long, unglamorous work of restoring the machinery that had rusted under his predecessor. These qualities, which in a healthy political culture would have made him exactly what Rome needed, had become in the culture that 12 years of Commodus had produced almost incomprehensible. The Guard looked at this earnest, disciplined old soldier, and they saw nothing they recognized as worth protecting. And on a March morning in 193 AD, a group of soldiers walked into the palace and killed him. What happened next was unprecedented, even by Roman standards, and Rome had been setting precedents for centuries in the category of political dysfunction. The Praetorian Guard, having killed the emperor they had just installed, announced that the office was available. Not metaphorically available, actually available. They held an auction. Two wealthy senators bid against each other for the throne of the most powerful empire in the Western world, and the Guard sold it to the higher offer. A man named Didius Julianus purchased the Roman Empire for a price that ancient sources record with the incredulous precision of men who cannot believe they are writing what they are writing. The empire spiraled. Generals in the provinces heard what had happened and began moving their legions toward Rome. The year of the five emperors unfolded over the months that followed, a cascade of military conflict and political chaos that cost more lives than any of the calculations anyone had made on the night of December 31st had accounted for. The rot that Commodus had cultivated for 12 years was not removed when Commodus was removed. It was already in the walls. Marcia did not become a celebrated liberator. She did not receive temples or formal recognition or any of the external markers of a person who has done something historically significant. She continued to exist in the imperial household under the new arrangements, and when Didius Julianus consolidated his brief hold on power, he ordered her execution along with Eclectus. The woman who had freed Rome from 12 years of direct tyranny was consumed by the same violent current that had drowned countless others before her, the same current that she had known, with the calculating intelligence she had spent her life developing, would probably consume her. The question that her story leaves hanging in the air is not whether she made the right choice. The question is whether she knew the choice would cost her everything and made it anyway. And if she did, what that tells us about the nature of the decision. She had spent years learning to read rooms. She understood consequences better than almost anyone in the empire. She could calculate with reasonable accuracy what followed from any given action. And she took the action. So either she did not see what was coming, which is inconsistent with everything we know about her, or she saw it and decided that the cost was acceptable, that doing nothing was a worse option than doing something fatal, that the world she would leave behind by acting was preferable to the world she would leave behind by waiting. There is something in that calculation that Marcus Aurelius would have recognized. He wrote in the Meditations about the gap between outcomes and intentions, about the way a man can do everything correctly and still have the result come out wrong, about accepting this without letting it become a reason for inaction, because the alternative to acting on your best judgment is simply to wait for events to act on you, which is itself a choice and not the better one. He wrote about the men who came before him, emperors and generals and statesmen who had shaped and broken and rebuilt the empire across centuries, and about how none of them, not one, had managed to fully control what came after them. They built institutions. They trained successors. They wrote laws and established precedents and tried to leave the structure stronger than they found it. And then they bud, and the structure did what structures do in the presence of the people who inherit them, which is reveal its weaknesses. The places where the stone was thin, the joints where the mortar had never fully set, the load-bearing elements that turned out under new pressure to be less capable than the original architect had believed. Marcus understood this. He had spent his reign shoring up foundations, strengthening joints, adding load-bearing capacity wherever he could find it. He had done this work with the diligence of a man who knew that every emperor is eventually succeeded by someone who is not him, and that the quality of what comes next depends in part on the quality of what was left behind. He had done everything right on the institutional level, and then he had handed the entire structure to a young man who would spend 12 years methodically dismantling it, because the one variable Marcus could not control was also the most important one. Marcus Aurelius was right about almost everything. The Stoic philosophy he practiced and recorded was genuinely among the most useful ways a human being has ever developed for thinking about how to live inside a reality that resists control. He was right about duty. He was right about impermanence. He was right about the importance of acting from principle regardless of outcome. He was right about so much. He was wrong about one thing. He believed, or allowed himself to believe, that a good man could guarantee a good heir. That virtue, properly applied through the right combination of education and example and opportunity, could be transmitted across the gap between one person and another. That what he had built in himself could be built in his son if he found the right methods and applied them with sufficient patience. This belief led him to look away from the evidence that was accumulating from the time Commodus was 11 years old and ordering men burned alive for lukewarm bathwater. This belief cost the empire 12 years of Commodus and then the chaos that followed. No man can guarantee what his successor will do with what he leaves behind. He can try. He can build institutions strong enough to survive bad leadership. He can choose successors carefully. He can model the behavior he hopes to see continued. But he cannot make the choice for the person who comes after him. That person will make their own choices in their own time, shaped by forces that precede the transfer of power and extend far beyond it. What Laodice and Marcia and Eclectus proved in the end was something smaller and less philosophically satisfying than a lesson about power or legacy or the limits of Stoic wisdom. They prove simply that even when every institution has failed, even when every legitimate mechanism for accountability has been hollowed out, even when the cost of action is almost certainly fatal, there are still people who will act. Not because acting saves them, because doing nothing is not actually an option they can live with, and they have run out of other choices. They were not heroes in the classical sense. They did not act from a place of clean intention or strategic clarity or moral certainty about the rightness of their cause. They acted because they found their names on a list scheduled for dawn, and when they looked at the alternatives, there were none. The heroism, if it belongs there at all, is not in the moment of action, but in the years that preceded it. In enduring what had to be endured long enough to understand exactly what they were dealing with. In learning the landscape of the danger completely before attempting to navigate it. In holding the knowledge of what was necessary and waiting until the moment when waiting became impossible. The emperor, who renamed the months and announced that he would govern from the arena floor and believed that his strength was beyond mortal measurement, died on a wet stone floor in a private room with no audience and no record of his last words and no theatrical apparatus of any kind. He died exactly as any other man dies, which was the one outcome he had spent his entire life constructing elaborate fictions to avoid confronting. Absolute power did not make Commodus a god. It only confirmed what was always true, that he had always been empty in the place where the self that can be measured against something larger than itself is supposed to live. Marcus Aurelius's tragedy was not that he failed to see this. He saw it in the end clearly. His tragedy was that he saw it too late to act on what he saw and then ran out of time. The tent on the Danube, the dying lamp, the son who walked in and walked out while his father opened his mouth and found that after a lifetime of words, the right ones had finally failed to arrive. Some things cannot be fixed by a good man's intentions. Some things can only be endured, and then when the endurance reaches its limit, ended. Laodice knew this. Marcia knew this. Eclectus knew this. They paid the price that knowledge extracts from the people who act on it. And Rome kept going, as Rome does, scarred and diminished, and already building the next set of problems that the next generation would have to reckon with, carrying forward the accumulated weight of everything that had happened and everything that had been broken and everything that had been lost, the way civilizations always carry their history, not cleanly, not completely, but forward. The historians who wrote about Commodus in the generations that followed, men like Cassius Dio and Herodian, set down their accounts with the controlled fury of people who had either lived through what they were describing or heard it from people who had. They preserved the details not as entertainment, but as testimony. The damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of his memory, that the Senate proclaimed, failed in the one way that actually matters. It failed to make people forget. You cannot chisel a man off the memory of an empire. You can remove his name from stone. You cannot remove him from the minds of everyone who was alive while he was. Later emperors, most notably Septimius Severus, selectively rehabilitated Commodus's image when it served their political purposes. Statues were dismantled and quietly reconstructed. Dedications were reinstated. The machine of power found uses for his memory that it had not found for his life, which is the way these things tend to work. The living Commodus had been an obstacle and a catastrophe. The dead Commodus was a precedent that could be invoked when convenient. But none of that changes what actually happened in those 12 years. Not the senators chewing their laurel leaves, not the people dragged from the streets and killed inside the arena, while crowds applauded the murder of their neighbors because the alternative to applauding was becoming the next body on the sand. Not the architects of their own survival, Marcia and Laodice and Eclectus, making their calculation on a cold December night and accepting a cost they could not avoid. Every civilization that has ever existed has produced a version of this story. The accumulation of power in hands that cannot hold it responsibly. The slow erosion of the checks that were supposed to prevent exactly this. The long period of deterioration during which everyone can see what is happening and almost no one acts because acting first is the most dangerous position available, and waiting is more survivable, right up until the moment when waiting becomes the same as dying. And then always the small group of people who find themselves at the end of all the waiting with nothing left to lose and a decision to make. These are not extraordinary people in the sense that makes for comfortable mythology. They are ordinary people whose circumstances have become extraordinary. Their courage, if we want to call it that, is not the courage of someone who chooses danger from a position of safety. It is the courage of someone who has run out of safe positions and discovers in that moment that they are still capable of choosing how to move forward even when all the options are bad. Marcus Aurelius would have understood this. He wrote about it in different terms and from a position of philosophical remove in the Meditations. He wrote about the man who does what can be done with what is available, who does not waste the present, lamenting the past or fearing the future, who acts on his best judgment in the knowledge that outcomes cannot be controlled and that the act of choosing well is its own justification regardless of what follows. He wrote all of this and believed all of this and failed in his own life to apply it to the one situation where it mattered most, which was the question of what to do about his son. He should have acted earlier. He knew it. The furnace story told him what he needed to know, and he filed it under immaturity and moved on. Every subsequent year added more evidence, and he filed each new piece under the same heading, and the heading grew too heavy to hold everything he had put in it, and still he held on. Because the alternative required him to look at the thing he had helped create and say clearly and without mitigation that it could not be corrected, that it could only be contained or replaced. And that is not a thing a father can easily say about a child he loves, even when the child has become an emperor who murders people for entertainment. This is the part of the story that does not appear in the official record. The grief of Marcus Aurelius is not preserved in any document we have. The Meditations do not mention Commodus by name. The private anguish of a man who spent his life building something and then watched it be dismantled by his own blood is available to us only by inference, by reading between the lines of a philosophical journal that was never meant to be read by anyone but the man who wrote it. But it is there, in the passages about acceptance, in the passages about the things we cannot control, in the passages written in the last years of his life, when the tone shifts from the confident clarity of a man still working toward understanding to the quieter register of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not want to arrive and is now trying to make his peace with it. He made his peace. That is the most Marcus Aurelius thing about him. He found a way to continue functioning, to continue leading, to continue writing and thinking and governing with whatever integrity was available to him, even while carrying the knowledge of what he had failed to prevent. That capacity, the capacity to absorb a terrible truth and continue rather than collapse, is perhaps the most genuinely stoic thing he ever demonstrated. Not the philosophy books, not the brilliant passages about duty and impermanence, the ability to keep writing on the last night of his life with a dying lamp and a cold tent, and the sound of the frontier wind outside, knowing what was coming and unable to stop it and still refusing to simply stop. Some things cannot be fixed by a good man's intentions. Some things can only be endured, and then when the endurance reaches its limit, ended. Latus knew this. Marcia knew this. Eclectus knew this. They paid the price that knowledge extracts from the people who act on it. And Rome kept going, as Rome does, scarred and diminished, and already building the next set of problems that the next generation would have to reckon with, carrying forward the accumulated weight of everything that had happened, and everything that had been broken, and everything that had been lost, the way civilizations always carry their history, not cleanly, not completely, but forward. Always forward.